Hello, my name is Oliver Garner, and welcome to the latest RevDem Rule of Law podcast. Our guest today is Professor Nandini Ramanujam, a full professional at the Faculty of Law of McGill University and co-director of the Centre for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism, where she supervises the Academic Freedom Monitoring Clinic. Nandini has recently co-authored an op-ed for RevDem, considering academic freedom and the rule of law in Poland, Hungary, and Russia, which will be the topic of our conversation today. So thank you very much for joining us today, Nandini. It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Oliver, and I'm looking forward to this very important and timely conversation.
Fantastic. So for my first question, I thought I would start from first principles and ask you what you think is the theoretical connection between academic freedom and the rule of law. Does academic freedom entrench the rule of law through scholarly research on the concept? And is the rule of law required to ensure academic freedom?
Thanks for getting it started and getting it started with a very difficult question. And the analogy which comes to my mind is from my work in the field of the rule of law and development. That's where most of my work is focused. And after 7 decades of scholarly explorations, insights from policymakers and practitioners, the best one could do is to establish a tenuous connection, a tenuous relationship between the rule of law and development. Whether the rule of law is essential for development or whether certain level of economic development ought to happen before the rule of law culture can flourish and take roots. So it's a classic chicken and egg problem here. And as you know, the rule of law is neither rule nor law, but a political ideal that concentrates on restricting the arbitrary use of power by delineating the proper function of government and detailing the processes to which decision and law making should conform. The rule of law evolved over centuries of political turmoil in Western Europe and has roots in ancient Greek philosophy. The modern state is constituted around certain fundamental principles that form the basis of the legitimate exercise of political power, human rights being one branch, and democracy and the rule of law the other two of this tripod. The rule of law is thus woven into the fabric of Western legal system and is at all times concerned with delineating power relations. However, its conceptions are manifold and fall within a wide spectrum from procedural to substantive one. Theoretically speaking, the rule of law is an end in itself, it's a good in itself. However, from development point of view, it acquires a more instrumental conception. It is a means to reach a desired goal or desired end. And there are necessary conditions for building the rule of law. And some of these necessary conditions are the legal culture, political and economic conditions, and the international law framework. And I think one could extend this framework into looking at academic freedom. And similar to the rule of law, the general understanding of academic freedom is tied to the contemporary idea of a Western liberal university, which has its origin in Europe. It is still difficult to dissociate the notion of academic freedom from its historical underpinnings. From Universitas, a community of scholars, to the modern day university, the conception of academic freedom has continued to evolve. Academic freedom could be seen as a good in itself, or it could be seen as necessary for the promotion of a greater social good, greater public good. In a recent report from the former UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, David Kay, this is a report to the UN Human Rights Council, he's elaborated academic freedom, and I quote, as the freedom of individuals as members of academic community in their own pursuit to conduct activities involving the discovery and transmission of information and ideas, and to do so with the full protection of human rights law, unquote. This elaboration sees state as the main antagonist. As we argue in our op-ed, and hopefully the article we would like to publish with you, is the relationship between academic freedom and the rule of law is a bidirectional one. The rule of law places constraints on the use of arbitrary power and procedural safeguards which prevent threats to academic freedom, in particular by state authorities. In turn, academic freedom facilitates intellectual debate, critique of entrenched values, and foster ideological plurality that are vital to the flourishment of democratic societies that adhere to the rule of law. As the op-ed argues, without a minimalist procedural rule of law guarantee, it would be difficult to protect academic freedom, and vice versa. Without having academic freedom, it would be difficult to foster a democratic society. However, this does not mean that the minimalist guarantee of the rule of law is sufficient to uphold the principles of academic freedom. The pressures, threats on academic freedom are varied. State is an important actor here, as we see in the case of Poland, Hungary, and Russia, and in many other parts of the world. However, threats to academic freedom from non-state actors, such as extremist groups, powerful corporations, donors, religious institutions, the extreme right and the left, and others are equally menacing. In our work on monitoring academic freedom in the context of Nigeria, in our advocacy clinic, we have noted the role of non-state armed groups in disrupting the life of academic institutions. Academic freedom, in a substantive sense, is not possible without civil and political freedoms, a government bound by the rule of law, an independent judiciary, free, informed, and plural media. However, without the necessary material conditions for the functioning of a modern university, the principles of academic freedom may fall short of their desired objectives. And as you can see, financial levers have been used in Hungary to curtail academic freedom. So it is a very difficult question, but clearly there is a nexus, there is a strong relationship between these two big liberal ideas.
Thank you so much for that really interesting overview and drawing out those connections between the two concepts. And you mentioned there how academic freedom derived from the same Western liberal tradition as the rule of law. And yet, as you argue in your op-ed, we see these risks to academic freedom arising in Europe, in Hungary and Poland, as well as Russia. And so my next question for you, Nandini, was whether you believe all of these examples and others, such as the Bosphorus University in Turkey and the recent controversy over the expulsion of certain French academics, do you believe these cases are all part of the same phenomenon of autocratic capture within society? Or do you think that there are distinct explanations between the cases?
Thanks once again. There's so much to think about here. Populist governments may have similar manifestations, such as demonizing its political and ideological opponents, undermining the rule of law, and suppression of dissent. However, the drivers in Poland and Hungary are different. I turn to the wisdom of Ivan Krastev, who claims that, and I quote him, at the heart of the populist counter-revolution is a radical rejection of the imperative to imitate the liberal democratic West, unquote. In his 2019 reflection piece entitled Metamorphosis of Central Europe, he explores the phenomenon of the rise of illiberalism and native nationalism in Central Europe. He, like many other scholars, critiqued the shock therapy approach to systemic transformation, which forced former Eastern Bloc countries to import and transplant liberal democratic political institutions, as well as a market economy framework. I believe that accession to the EU, the European Union, necessitated adoption of over 20,000 laws and regulations without involving much democratic deliberation. It was fast and furious. Looking around the world, top-down transplantation of democracy seldom yields desired results. Institutions are, after all, humanly devised constraints to structure political, social, and economic interactions. There is primacy of embedded cultural and social norms, which shift slowly. They do shift, and they shift while interacting with faster moving institutions such as politics and law, the formal side of things. I think the rise of illiberal democracy as well as the state of academic freedom in Hungary and Poland demonstrates the gap between these formal institutions, which were top-down implanted, and these embedded norms, and there is contestation. Krasdev calls this a moral and psychological downside of adopting a foreign model of political economy. Both Poland and Hungary have also witnessed brain drain amidst an aging population and low fertility rate, which reinforces the sentiment of loss of culture, identity, a sentiment weaponized by populist politicians. There are winners and losers of the systemic transformation in these societies, and the backlash comes from the manipulation of people who feel the sense of loss of self-esteem, identity, culture, and more. I see the current turbulence as a part of the democracy building project. The stifling of academic institutions, other democratic institutions, civil society. This is unlikely to turn the course of democratization of these societies. It is just a phase where I think resilience and fight, which we see happening, will continue to happen. So that's my quick read of the situation, but there is so much more which could be unpacked to understand why and what is happening in Central Europe.
You mentioned there Ivan Krasev's ideas of the imitation of Western institutions and norms. And so I wonder whether we could see, or if you perceive there to be a threat of this reverse phenomenon of imitation, whereby threats to academic freedom could spread into Western Europe. And I'm thinking here of particular examples such as the French government's rhetoric against Islamic leftism in French universities. So from your research, do you think that there is such a risk to academic freedom spreading into Western Europe?
It is once again a very interesting question, and so you have referred to the French government's rhetoric of Islamic leftism, which is being blamed for the erosion of the Republican values and freedoms. I think states in Western Europe and elsewhere are using different bogeymen as the culprit for weakening the liberal democratic social fabric. And I think some of the drivers may not be dissimilar to what we are seeing in Central Europe. So In my view, economic globalization and technological revolutions are important drivers, among others, for the unprecedented level of migration in general and towards the EU in particular. This has led to the rapid diversification of Western European societies, sparking fear of erosion of cultural identity, which is not so different from the popular sentiment in Hungary and Poland. Make America Great Again rhetoric of Trump and the political chasm in the US is similar in terms of psychological manifestation of a romanticized past and a glorious monolithic culture, which is being attacked by what is going on. I would like to go back in history to underscore that academic freedom has come under threat at various points due to ideological contestations. Yeah. During the Cold War, in the US and Canada, academics were let go, persecuted, or were not hired due to their pro-communist leanings. A University of Toronto historian named Frank Underhill lost his job for criticizing Canadian government's foreign policy during interwar years. Ideologies have always been some ideologies deemed to be subversive of the state. There are new ideologies and actors which are perceived as a threat to the existing social and normative order. It is not just leftist Islamic leftism in France, and I'm quoting it. I don't know what it means. But in the UK, the controversy involving Jesus College, Cambridge, and Huawei donation, the Chinese giant telecom donation, and government of UK getting involved, points to new trends around perceived and real threats involving states, powerful corporations, and certainly extremist ideologies. China's assertion on the global scene as a powerful political and economic actor presents a new ideological challenge to the liberal paradigm. It is no longer the old-fashioned communism, but something much more complex and difficult to neatly pack under a simple ideological box or definition. So I think, yes, you're right that vigilance is needed. And I think perhaps Western European states where they do well on the rule of law side things, at least de jure, does not mean that we can be comfortable and assume that academic liberties are not or may not come under threat. So I think vigilance is very important. Both Quebec and Ontario in Canada have seen populist politicians appropriating academic freedom concept to further their agendas. Academic freedom, like other fundamental freedoms, are hard-earned. And as I just mentioned, that call for vigilance and commitment, not just from the academy, but from larger society for its protection. So yes, it's live, it's real.
Thank you. For my next question, I'd like to reflect a little bit upon your own academic profile, and this is relevant to a section of RevDem which considers cross-regional dialogue. So I wonder whether you believe being based in North America, in Canada, outside of Europe, allows you a broader perspective on these troubling developments happening within Europe. And you mentioned in your last question, your last answer, about examples in America of during the McCarthy era and examples within Canada of threats in the past. And so my follow-up question was whether you see similar signs of threats to academic freedom in Canada and the USA at this present moment.
Yes, life in the academy is there's never a dull moment, and which is a good thing. It keeps us on our feet and makes us think about what we mean when we say academic freedom. So the current social and political turbulence calls for social justice, inclusion, equality, equity, which we are witnessing in the academy in particular, but society in general, is not unique to our time. There has been slow and steady democratization of higher education space. Rapid diversification of university community is a distinct and attractive characteristic of global universities. CU is a great example of that. The rich demographic and intellectual diversity are having transformative impact on innovation in teaching, research, and knowledge sharing. This rapidly transformed university landscape makes us forget that not long ago, university was a bastion of elite men who fiercely guarded the academy by keeping so many groups out. So coming back to North America and a little bit of history before we talk about what is going on, is in the 1930s and 40s, Canadian universities imposed quota on admission of Jewish students. Other minority groups were barely represented. Women, if hired, which was not that often, were not equally paid, had little chance of upward mobility. In this context, academic freedom was guaranteed to some, yet it was constrained by excluding both social and intellectual diversity. The 1960s social justice movement within and outside the academy led to significant changes, not only in bringing previously excluded and underrepresented groups in the university, but it also transformed the governance of North American universities into a more democratic one. This process of democratization is happening at a more rapid pace in the universities across the world, but particularly in North America. What we see here now in our context in North America is continuation of the struggle with new voices and groups seeking equity and justice. The perceived threat to academic freedom, which in my view is inaccurate, is due to the creation of a false binary between academic freedom and equality and social justice demands coming from previously marginalized groups. Liberal universities have always been leaders in advancing social justice agenda. What we ought to do here is to reconcile academic freedom as an individual right with group-based demands for equality, which is group rights perspective here. And liberal societies liberal rule of law bound societies use law and policies to reconcile individual and group rights. And liberal global universities are precisely doing this. McGill University has pushed forward a transformative equity, diversity, and inclusion agenda with policies and initiatives to level the playing field for the previously underrepresented and excluded groups. This is an example, and it's an important one, of positive measures necessary to democratize the university space, create an enabling environment for participation in the life of the university for a diverse university community. These efforts are to strengthen and advance the mission of a liberal university and go beyond looking at the protection of academic freedom merely as a negative right. And there are efforts to create sort of an equal opportunities landscape, which in my view reinforces academic freedom rather than restricts it. But the media plays this game of pitching this as a binary, academic freedom versus the equality agenda. And it is unrolling as we speak in Quebec media. Every day there is an article on this issue. The pressure on academic freedom is coming from both extremes of the ideological spectrum, the left and the right. Both get a lot of attention in the media and society. However, you know, as a teacher, as a professor, as a researcher, what I see is a vast majority of scholars, students, administrators are committed to fostering a free and respectful environment for teaching, learning, and knowledge production. So is that a real threat in North America? I would say no. Should we not be vigilant? No, that is also a no. We should remain vigilant. I think media and social media and a lot of misinformation and misconception about academic freedom, which is floating, has to be confronted with. So yes, it is a very turbulent time on campuses right now.
Thank you so much for the depth of your engagement and the historical overview as well. I feel I'm learning a lot about academic freedom personally. And for the next question, I thought perhaps we could drill down a little bit into the binary that you presented and also return to some of the theoretical first principles of academic freedom. And so my question for you was whether you believe there are limits to academic freedom where it can be justifiably curtailed for other public goods. You've discussed wartime context, for example, so perhaps public security could be such an example. So yeah, I wonder whether there are indeed limits to academic freedom.
Academic freedom, like freedom itself, is not absolute. Its purpose is to pursue truth and knowledge for the good of the society. Freedoms always come with obligations. I would like to emphasize on the end goal here, which is public good and social good. In my view, all matters involving social, political, and ideological contestations in the university sphere could be deliberated and resolved with greater social good in sight if the principles of academic freedom are respected by all stakeholders. Curtailing academic freedom, in my opinion, would harm rather than help this process of informed deliberations. As mentioned earlier, academic freedom comes with responsibilities and it's governed by academic rules, regulations, and custom. In Canada, academic freedom is constrained by the professional standards of the relevant discipline and the responsibility of the university to organize its academic mission. The key is to remind ourselves that academic freedom guarantee to individual academics and safeguards for institutional autonomy are meant to serve the larger public good. Referring to Popper's idea of open society, which I grew up with when I was in Budapest, I think liberal universities which foster a space for critical inquiry and debates are vital for building open and democratic societies. University is a community of inquiry, and university sits within a larger community, which is our society, and it's no longer our immediate society, it is the global society. The empowerment which comes with academic freedom obliges us to use this freedom responsibly and for advancing the well-being of society. And once again, it's the global society. We are so interconnected that we cannot just think about our own backyard. So with that in mind, I think in abstract to have a conversation whether some restriction on academic freedom are desirable if they meet a certain end goal would be a difficult one to have. And I think this freedom does come with a lot of responsibility and regulation within the academy.
Earlier in our conversation, we talked about the background to the current situation in Central Europe of accession to the European Union. So I was wondering whether you believe that the EU and other international organizations could do more to promote and protect academic freedom and to combat state attempts to curtail these freedoms.
Yeah, this is once again brings me back to all the work and critique of building the rule of law abroad. Carruthers has a damning critique of what we do and how we do it. Promotion and protection of academic freedom, similar to human rights, has been mostly pursued through and continues to be so through the negative freedoms and negative rights perspective. Although post-Cold War, the sharp binary between the blue and the red rights, the binary has collapsed. The rule of law, human rights, academic freedom, protection work tends to be pursued only through the civil and political rights framework. Borrowing from, again, a great Central European jurist, Karel Vasak's 3 Generations of Rights framework, academic freedom has to be promoted through an integrated framework of negative, positive, and solidarity rights framework. In many contexts, particularly in low middle-income countries, frail and fragile states, the threat to academic freedom does not come from just the state, but there are a variety of forces. Armed conflicts involving non-state actors threaten academic freedom. Lack of financial resources curtail academic freedom. Without security of tenure, or simply put, job security, without access to necessary material and scholarly resources for knowledge production, without opportunities for knowledge dissemination and peer exchange, the academic endeavor is not what is idealized by the liberal university model. Investment in institutions of higher education should be a priority for the EU, other OECD countries, multilateral organizations. I'd refer to the Goal 17 of the Sustainable Development Platform, which is about partnership and cooperation to achieve the Sustainable Development Agenda. And I believe that this could be a good framework to guide EU and other donor efforts to advance academic freedom agenda. So the target 17.6 of this goal speaks to enhancing North-South, South-South, and triangular regional and international cooperation on and access to science, technology, and innovation, and enhance knowledge sharing on mutually agreed terms, including through improved coordination among existing mechanisms. The emphasis here is on science and technology, and the target does not specifically speak about universities. However, in addition to using incentives and disincentives for recipient states to respect academic freedom, efforts must be made to strengthen capacity of universities in wherever EU is working or working through various overseas assistance programs. I think monitoring, reporting, and advocacy are necessary, but not sufficient tools to guarantee academic freedom. So once again, having a more comprehensive approach to academic freedom might help advance the agenda further than simply using the carrot and stick to contain the state, which is important, but certainly not sufficient here.
You mentioned earlier this quite powerful idea of a global society as the subject of academia and research. And so my question for you, Nandini, is whether you believe in the future, can technology, such as massively open online courses, be used as a tool to transcend and overcome specific state interference with universities?
Yes, it's particularly in the Zoom world, the way we are connecting today, and it wouldn't be possible even a couple of years ago. It's a very important question. Technology and web-based information exchange and knowledge mobilization does have an emancipatory potential for facilitating dialogue that transcend territorial boundaries. before I actually speak to the potential, I would just also like to be a little cautious with the emergence of surveillance states and the current climate where information ecosystems are being manipulated and interfered by powerful state and non-state actors. And it is posing a serious threat to democratic institutions, in something which a recent chapter I have co-authored on information disorders. The so-called information disorder has, as we can see, has had a demonstrable effect on tampering with electoral process. But it doesn't stop there. And I think something more insidious is happening. And the impact is the populist governments have deliberately destabilized the information ecosystems of their countries, creating information disorders and which is to their advantage, an advantage to other vested interest groups. And the traditional checks and balances on information flow are no longer effective in this context, where there is an exponential rise of new media and social medias. And amidst this overload of information, ordinary citizens are unable to distinguish between credible and false information. And this has a considerable impact on the academy in terms of having informed and critical debates. So that's just a word of caution that the technology is fabulous, but the regulatory framework is not there yet. And there is a lot of manipulation going on by pretty much anyone who has power, private, public, and others. So with that in mind, I would still, I concur that with you that there is a tremendous potential for this, not just of massive online open access course, but various other pathways to engage with the issue of academic freedom. So MOOC could be an effective platform for fostering an understanding of the often misunderstood concept of academic freedom, which we know it is even in our context. So I just noted that the Scholars at Risk Network has just launched an online open access course entitled Why Academic Freedom Matters. The course is based on the description I looked at, aims to explore the relationship between academic freedom and democratic society. This course is informed by their 2-decade-long experience in the field of protecting and promoting academic freedom. And if I understand correctly, the larger goal of the course is to underscore the importance of academic freedom to the inclusive, sustainable development, social development side of things. Once again, I come back to some mistakes which we have made in doing human rights and rule of law work in the field and trying to, if lessons could be learned. So what the trials and tribulations of promoting the rule of law and human rights in vastly different societies has taught us one thing, that there is no template which could work everywhere. There is no one size which would fit all contexts and societies. It is critical to understand context-specific particularities, customs, norms, value systems in order to advance academic freedom, goals of promoting and protecting academic freedom. Like the rule of law, academic freedom is a cherished ideal of liberal democratic societies. And as we know, that the world does not consist only of liberal democratic societies and polities. It would be important to have a diversity of perspectives on the concept of academic freedom. So if there were to be courses, I think it is important that they are not just coming from the US and Europe. I think collaborative development of courses involving people, say, from Egypt, from Malaysia, where freedoms look quite different, would be an interesting thing to do. I think to provide a diverse range of perspective on what academic freedom means in different contexts. Our work on the article and the op-ed on Poland, Hungary, and Russia brought us new insights into the role of universities, higher education institutions, what was the role, what the state thought the role was, particularly in the USSR, and how it has extended beyond the USSR now to modern-day Russia. The fast and furious top-down systemic transformation of Russia to a liberal market economy has produced far from expected results. There are no surprises there. Institutional transplants are seldom successful. Norm nudging and creation of new ones is a slow process, and even on academic freedom matters. The higher education sphere and its freedom, similar to the civil society media, are highly contested spaces in many parts of the world. And I think this contestation will lead to norm creation. There will be new norms, bottom up, more organic. So what we could do is to provide avenues. These massive open online courses could provide us ways in which we can understand how these norm shifting is happening, how people are understanding academic freedom. Just like in Western Europe, academic freedom was an evolving idea. And it has had its own trials and triumphs. So it's important that diversity of perspective to be captured through the online platform.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. For our final question, I'd like to reflect upon RevDem, Review of Democracy's parent organization, and ask you, Nandini, what would be your advice to CEU and its students and other higher education and civil society organizations in the face of pressure from governments that threaten academic freedom?
It's a nice way to end this conversation. I don't have any advice. I don't think I am in a position to give advice, but I could share some things which has shaped my own life and my own professional trajectory, and it continues to inform my engagement with projects such as this. So I'm a great believer in solidarity, and therefore I did invoke Basek's three-generation framework. The higher education and civil society spaces are more connected globally than ever before. Technology has facilitated connections, space for dialogue, and ease of exchange of ideas, something which was not possible when CEU was founded in 1991. And COVID-19, which disrupted our normal life, has also acted as a catalyst to exploit technology for teaching, knowledge dissemination, and more. So a little bit of sort of personal history here is my formative years have been shaped by the experience of teaching economics in Lithuania between 1992 and 94 with a small NGO called Civic Education Project, which has been absorbed by the CEU now in some capacity. And Civic Education Project was founded by two young social scientists. They were doing their PhDs, one at Harvard, one at Yale. And it was supported by Open Society Institute, among many other donors. And the mission of CEP was to foster dialogue and academic exchange between Western liberal universities and recently opened up universities in East Central Europe and the former Soviet Union. The idea was very simple. young social scientists from liberal universities would spend 1 or 2 academic years teaching new courses, introducing pedagogical innovations, while learning from their local peers about the challenges and opportunities facing the higher education space. So it was very peer oriented program. There was symbiotic learning among peers and between visitors and students and colleagues. Although the project did not invoke academic freedom, this happened before the websites became common. So we never had a website. So I couldn't find much information, but I know that we did not talk so much about academic freedom. It was informed by principles of free exchange of ideas, the central role of critical inquiry in teaching and research. And there were many similar projects which ensued in the 90s. And the idea was to bring about systemic change in higher education from within. Hungarian and Polish universities enthusiastically partnered in hosting young professors. And CEU, which was founded in 91, the same year as Civic Education Project, was informed by a complementary approach to bringing about systemic change. And this was from outside. And several new academic institutions in Russia and other Eastern European countries were created as model institutions, which were expected to provide impetus for change in teaching and scholarship in social sciences and the humanities. CEU was and remains central to this project. And in the 90s, I remember CEU was this model institution which hosted student conferences, and we would travel from different paths, from Kazakhstan to Ukraine, to come to Budapest then. And these students, young students, this was their dream, that this is where they want to come for their postgraduate degrees. And I think institutions such as CEU are a testimony to the trials and tribulations of building bottom-up global liberal institutions. It's not a given. And I think from Prague to Budapest to Vienna, CEU is a living testimony of the importance of international solidarity, resilience, and a commitment to liberal education. Students at CEU are privileged to be part of this extraordinary institution, such as I was privileged to be part of a great institution. And thus I volunteered to go and teach in Lithuania under circumstances which were far from ideal, and I knew nothing about teaching. So I think the call would be, or if at all I could say something to the students, is to lending solidarity and support to less privileged peers, peer institutions across the region, across the globe, through whichever opportunity you can find to engage yourself with. And ultimately, I think the individual who gets involved comes out of it with a transformative experience, which is tremendous. So that's my a little bit of sharing of what I did in the past.
Well, thank you so much for those inspiring final words. And I hope at RevDem we will also seek to pursue that goal. And thank you in general for an enlightening discussion that I'm sure will be very informative for our readers on academic freedom. And I'd encourage our listeners to engage also with your op-ed, which is published on the RevDem platform at the moment. So thank you once again, Nandini, for wonderful.
Thank you, Oliver, for inviting me to have this conversation. It made me think about many things which otherwise I would not have thought about. I appreciate the invitation, and thanks for accepting our op-ed for publication. It's the right place for it to be published. So we are very pleased and feel privileged to have that opportunity.